Red button's going. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution in this case has the burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Emanuel, the defendant, my client, did not act in self-defense. Think of it as the kind of proof you would require if you had to authorize a dangerous medical procedure for a child. You wouldn't settle for hunches, nor would you settle for guesses. Mr. Emanuel, in this case, my client, acted in self-defense when he warded off a vicious assault by a drunken Mr. Rashid wielding a metal crowbar. Mr. Emanuel was arrested for warding off an attack, winning the fight, and averting a potential tragedy. Mr. Emanuel's only crime, ladies and gentlemen, is successfully defending himself. Instead of someone ending up dead, the aggressor, Mr. Rashid, ended up without a tooth. Mr. Emanuel averted a possible tragedy. The facts of this case, ladies and gentlemen, are pretty straightforward. You've heard it throughout. I'm going to summarize them briefly. On the night of August 7th, 2009, Mr. Emanuel and Mr. Rashid were having a friendly conversation over a couple of beers. Mr. Rashid unexpectedly unleashes a verbal tirade against another fellow cab driver, Mr. Simons, an elderly man you heard here testify. Mr. Rashid had heard Simon had left the job early the previous night, and he was upset about that. Mr. Rashid did not like that. In overhearing this verbal tirade that Rashid was inflicting against Mr. Simons, Mr. Emanuel intervened, verbally defending Mr. Simons. "Why are you abusing other workers?" he asked. "Why are you abusing other workers?" Emanuel asked Rashid. Mr. Rashid at that point went ballistics. "Fuck you," he yells at Mr. Emanuel. "What's your problem?" Mr. Emanuel sensibly responds. At this point, Mr. Rashid wrings Mr. Emanuel's shirt. Mr. Emanuel pushes him away. The initial unprovoked attack against Mr. Emanuel was yet not enough for Mr. Rashid. Mr. Rashid goes to his trunk, pulls out a crowbar, and attacks Mr. Emanuel. In doing so, Mr. Emanuel, seeing Mr. Rashid coming at him with a crowbar, grabs Mr. Rashid's arm and pushes him away. The crowbar and Mr. Rashid simultaneously fall to the ground, and in the process, Mr. Rashid's tooth is knocked out from hitting the pavement. Thankfully, Mr. Emanuel was not killed that night. Mr. Emanuel is a 43-year-old father with no criminal record. He supports his wife, child, and 2 other family members in his home country, Bangladesh. As you'll hear the judge instruct you in this case, self-defense requires, number 1, the justified use of force in defending oneself. The force, a person has to reasonably believe that the force is necessary for the defense of oneself from what is reasonably believed to be the use or imminent use of unlawful physical force by another person. The degree of force has to be proportionate. Simply put, this means the use of force by a person acting in self-defense must not be out of proportion to the use or threat of force by the attacker. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, put yourself in Rashid's shoes for a minute. Imagine yourself having a conversation over a couple of beers when all of a sudden the person sitting next to you goes berserk, turns against you and engages in a rampage, runs to his trunk, pulls out a crowbar and attacks you. Freeze frame. You're in a garage with nowhere to run. Your children and loved ones are flashing through your mind as you scramble to keep yourself alive. You successfully disarm and ward off the attacker by eventually pushing him to the ground, averting the possibility of death or serious bodily injury. Isn't it reasonable to believe that force is necessary when someone attacks you without any provocation and is literally inches away from shattering your skull? Of course it's reasonable. Is pushing someone to the floor to protect yourself from a metal weapon capable of shattering your skull proportionate? Pushing? Of course it is. The prosecution asserts that Mr. Emanuel should have left the scene, and therefore he had an obligation to retreat. You heard the testimony of Mr. Simons, of how that garage looks. You heard the testimony of Mr. Rashid. There's only one entrance and only one exit. Mr. Emanuel had nowhere to go. He was on the opposite end of the garage. When someone is coming at you with a metal crowbar in a closed garage, where would a person go? Mr. Emanuel had nowhere to go. Thankfully, Mr. Emanuel successfully protected himself against a vicious attack and is now, unfortunately, faced with protecting himself from a vicious prosecution. First there was a crowbar, and now it's the gavel. In conclusion, this case is about Mr. Emanuel averting a vicious assault against him and being arrested for protecting his own life. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this man's life is in your hands. I ask you find him not guilty of all charges. Thank you.